Good morning, and welcome to the Mental Breakdown Morning Show. I'm Dr. Bernie Wilkinson.
I'm Dr. Richard Marshall.
And it's Tuesday, January 10th, 2017. Good morning.
Good morning.
Today we're going to talk, we mentioned yesterday that this is going to be kind of a hodgepodge week, but this week we're touching on today we're touching on a topic that I think is much more profound than we would typically have during a regular morning show, but we're going to just spend a little bit of time talking on it, and depending on how it goes, we may end up spending a lot more time on it later. But we're going to talk about a little bit about the impact of poverty today. Mm-hmm. We think about poverty as it relates to where you're living and some of those kinds of living conditions and things like that, but we really don't typically think about the impact of poverty on development, on education, and on our psychological health and well-being. Right. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And this was kind of cued from an article from the International Business Times that came out last week, January 3rd. January 3rd. And it's called, "What Does Poverty Look Like? Poor Children More Likely to Have Psychological Damage as Adults," this new study finds.
Right. And when you first mentioned this, I assumed it was the ACEs study, which was started in California by a pediatrician who began to see, as she followed children into adulthood, that she began to see this correlation between early poverty and later physical illness. And then as a result of that, there were higher rates of cancer, diabetes, and then she then expanded it into psychological problems, later psychological problems. And so we know there is this connection, some connection between poverty and later physical and mental health disorders.
Right. So the two parts we're going to
But this is different. This is a whole different study.
Yeah, this is a different study. But there's two pieces that we want to talk about. The first piece is from the article that they were talking about. And basically what they're saying is that the exposure of the chronic stress associated with living in poverty affects children's cognitive development. It affects their future problem-solving skills. It affects the way in which they approach issues. They are more likely to give up. So we have this whole idea, and it kind of ties together with things that we talked about before, like learned helplessness and some of those kinds of issues. So when we have children who come from families who live in poverty, we really have to work hard to make sure that we attempt to overcome some of those issues and teach some very specific skills so that they can hopefully overcome some of those issues.
That's right. Years ago, when we first, back in the 90s, when the National Reading Panel started its work, when we got this very intense interest in academic development, especially reading development in elementary age children, there was this explosion of literature on the achievement gap. Right. Why we saw it first as the difference between children of color and white children. We quickly realized that it wasn't a racial divide; it was an economic divide. And what we teach teachers now, our pre-service teachers, is it's not color; it's poverty.
Right. And now the issue, of course, related to that is that minority children are disproportionately represented in the poverty.
They're disproportionately poor.
Right.
Children of color are disproportionately poor.
Yeah, so they're more likely to grow up in poor families. But it really does seem to be the poverty, that poverty is the hub. That seems to really be the primary issue for these children and for even the adults who are living in those kinds of conditions.
That's right. And poverty does something to you.
Right.
And this, I think the ACEs study in California and this study, this was from New Jersey?
I think
it was New Jersey. These studies are beginning to shed light on what is it about poverty? What specifically does poverty do?
Right.
And here we see actual brain effects on
Right.
poverty, which then are translated as cognitive deficits,
Right.
emotional deficits, behavioral deficits. There are real functional deficits
Right.
that result from the stress, the underlying stress that is created by poverty.
Right. Now, the other part that we want to talk about is the more even academic part, maybe. So specifically reading, especially, and we know some of the work from Sally Shaywitz,
right.
but also some work from Joe Torgeson and some others that have really written and done a lot in this area, and those numbers are just fascinating to me. They call it the 30 million word gap by age 3. And so what that means is that children who live in poverty
Right.
here are exposed to 30 million fewer words than those children who grew up in middle and higher socioeconomic status homes. So that's a lot of words.
That's right.
It's a mountain that is really difficult to overcome.
And you talk about the preparation of children from birth to 5,
Right.
Getting ready for kindergarten. Here, these children of privilege have hundreds of thousands
Right.
of more words. Also, the sentence structures that they hear are much more complex.
Right.
So they're hearing double negatives and they're hearing compound sentences, whereas children in poverty simply don't get that same exposure.
Right.
And when you read, what you're doing is you're reading and translating it into what you hear, what you've heard. Well, if you've heard all of these rich, complex sentences and expansive vocabulary all of your life, you're going to be a much better reader.
Right. Just to give you some of the breakdown, it said in this study, was from 2003, I believe. It says, in other words, children from families on welfare heard about 616 words per hour, while those from working class families heard around 1,251 words per hour,
Right.
and those from professional families heard roughly 2,153 words per hour.
So you go from 600 to
1,200 to 2,100.
to 21. It almost doubles. So with each socioeconomic layer,
Right.
the number of words you hear increases.
Right.
It doubles.
Right.
Increases by a factor of 2.
And you may be thinking, well, okay, so that's the number of words they hear. What does it have to do with reading? Well,
Right.
your vocabulary is I guess we could say is a direct determining
Right.
factor for your ability
That's
to
right.
read.
If you encounter a word in text that you've never heard before, is one thing. What skilled readers do is they have this large vocabulary, so when they encounter a written word in text, they know what it is because
Right.
they've heard it in everyday
Right.
conversation.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've never heard it, and
There's a reference.
That's right. You have no reference.
Right. Yeah. You there's a test that we give, and it has the word brood in it, and there's a large group of people who take that test who have to ask what that word means.
Right.
And so now we have to explain it. So if you have never heard that word before, there's no context for you. So you would have you wouldn't be able to read it or to associate that with anything of meaning.
Right.
And so it limits your ability, it limits your reading comprehension, your understanding of what you're reading, and you certainly tend to spend much more time on those words because you sit there and you think brood. What is brood?
Right.
And so now all of a sudden all the fluent reading that you were doing perhaps has stopped. If we compound that with now there's
5 or 6 interruptions per sentence.
Right. Then now all of a sudden you can't have fluid reading. You
Right.
can't have when you can't have fluid reading, you can't have reading comprehension, and so you have all these issues with reading.
Right. What the other thing that Sally Shaywitz said is that children from the poorest layer, socioeconomic status, spend less than 1 minute per day reading
Right.
or being read to, So that's 8,000 words. Again, it's word counts.
Per year.
Children who spend 4.6 minutes hear about 280,000 words per year. But children who spend 20 minutes a day reading have almost 2 million words per year. Okay,
right,
so
that
again,
they're exposed to.
If you're not reading, if you're not hearing complex, sophisticated English, and if you're not reading, you're going to be woefully behind by the time you start school. And you're going to continue to fall behind because the students who are reading, who are in these language-rich environments, are just literally accumulating millions more words per year than children in poverty. So we see poverty at work in two ways. One is a language deficit, and the other is the stress factor.
Right, the stress factor. And we just read an article you wrote, one of your morning musings last week, about the impact of obesity and things like that. And again, we know that there's that those who are in poverty tend to eat less healthy. And when they eat less healthy, we tend to see health-related problems associated with obesity and weight-related issues. And we see that has an effect, perhaps a stress response effect. And so
that's right.
I guess what the mission for today is really just when folks when children grow up in poverty, the issues that they experience are not just, well, they just haven't been exposed to these things, or they just don't have experience with these things. There's some research now that it is much more fundamental than that. It's much more foundational than that. And we really need to make sure that we have programs and we have systems in place to help these children and these parents overcome some of those limitations so that we give these kids the best chance possible.
And we may be able to make up some of the ground with intensive instruction, but that's not the only problem we're battling. It's not, and I think that's what we're learning, because we're not closing that achievement gap as rapidly as we thought we would. And maybe the reason for that is because there are more issues than just intensive academic interventions that we need to consider when we're dealing with children in poverty.
Absolutely. So, all right.
That's good.
Well, I think that's it for today. There's not a lot of solutions to that problem right now, except intensive education, some of these early education programs, and making sure that we consider some of these things as we're thinking about different policies and different. Because we could get into the whole economics of the decreasing or disappearing middle class and all of that.
It's a public policy issue, that absolutely. We're going to have to somehow come to terms with. We cannot have a ossified lower class.
That's a great word.
Yeah, we can't let it solidify, because that's going to be a public policy problem. So,
what does ossified mean?
Harden. Like,
okay. See, I would have had to pause at that word because that
like a fossil.
Wasn't say fossilized. All right, so that's it for today. You guys have a great day today. We will be back tomorrow morning with another episode. We're going to talk about schools again a little bit tomorrow, but we're going to talk about schools from the perspective of discipline. We're going to talk about a fascinating topic of restorative justice.
Restorative justice.
So come back.
One of my favorites.
Check it out, and we'll talk to you then. All right. Bye-bye.